Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. This is Arnis Luks here at the Freedom Forum, and my guest from Canada, Wallace Klinck. Welcome, Wallace.
Hi there, Arnie. Nice to be with you again.
And you too, Wallace. Now, I wanted to place, we see our heading, Marxism, Christianity, and Dogma, and I wanted to
Hmm.
actually place dialectics being essentially an argument of opposites. I want to present here, we've got this on the front page of the website, the League website, is Mark Latham and his maiden speech. Now, I wanted to actually give a little bit of history about Mark Latham as I understand him. Now, Mark was been involved in the Labor movement since he was a young bloke, and in the, I think it was the 90s, he was actually Western Sydney. I think that's where he's from, and
Hmm.
he achieved a parliamentary position in this federal sphere, and he worked his way up to become party leader for the Labor Party in the federal sphere around 2004, I think it was 2004, 2005. And at that stage, he chose to leave. Now, he leave Parliament and attend to his children. And so he was a stay-at-home dad for about 14 years. But of course, he was always peripherally involved in Labor, things Labor. And as I understand it, he understands the philosophy, he understands the dogma of Marxism very, very clearly.
Hmm.
Now, currently, Mark Latham is involved with a conservative group, One Nation, Pauline Hanson, One Nation, and Mark Latham holds a position in the upper house, the Legislative Council, New South Wales, for this party, representing in the state of New South Wales. Now, the interesting part about his maiden speech is that I see that he is putting all the ticks in the boxes. He's putting all the ticks in the right boxes. And I find it fascinating because I am particularly concerned with a dialectical approach to the problems that are before us. And that is that you have Marxism, you have cultural Marxism coming at us like a steam train, and he's taking a position in antagonism to this cultural Marxism. But my concern is he part of the answer or is he just an extension of the problem? Wally, your thoughts?
Well, this is a very, very important question to consider, Arnie, because very frequently part of the Marxist approach, the dialectic approach, is to actually take up allegedly the cause of your opponents in order to throw people off track. In other words, if you can champion certain things which really fundamentally do not challenge the system, but which appeal to the other side because of their ideological conditioning. You can simply create a situation where nothing really constructive is going to happen, and the situation will just carry on under the same economic and ideological and propaganda influences without actually without anything really constructive occurring, because people are led to they're led to continue on in their preconceived inadequate ideas which don't really effectively deal with the problems that they are unhappy with and which are afflicting them. So you have to be very careful about. Now, I don't know anything about Mark Latham's background, but being a Canadian, I'm not familiar with it. But if he was involved heavily in the labor movement, one would have to assume that he has been very much exposed to the typical ideological influences that govern and affect the labor movement. So, and I noticed one thing, that he did not make any mention whatever of the financial factor. And this could be a very crucial issue with regard to his position. I mean, he's obviously got himself into a very influential position within Pauline Hanson's party. And so the question is, will he be leading it in the right direction, or will he be just holding it back?
Mm. I think that's an interesting observation, Wally, and I guess that's where I'm coming from on this thing, because I see there is a pushback, if you like, a fight for freedom. He made mention of the words, a fight for freedom, and that we
Yeah,
will never surrender. And I appreciate those things. And this is the concern I have, that good people can be actually drawn off the mark, can be drawn away from the critical target. And in my view, the critical target that we've got to consider is what is the power behind the throne? What is the real power that's actually influencing, dominating, emasculating our institutions, our parliaments, our politicians, our industrial leaders, if you like, our clergy, the church? What is this critical power behind all of it that's actually got such an insidious influence and causing, if you like, two sides appear to be poles apart, but never actually talk about the real problem. And the real problem is, of course, the money power behind all this. No one actually talks about it. No one talks about credit creation, the ability of privately owned institutions to issue the credit of the nation and do it in a fashion where, of course, the issue of the new credits they claim as their own property and
sure.
that in itself is insidious. Now, I haven't heard a word from any of the Conservatives, not a word, and yet historically Australia has got a wonderful history of the story of the Commonwealth Bank and the establishment of the Commonwealth Bank through the Labor Party, and I find that fascinating. That here it is, this man is claiming a huge Labor history a huge Labor history. He's claiming essentially the cultural roots of this same movement that initiated the Commonwealth Bank in Australia, and yet he makes no mention of it. He'll mention everything else, but he won't actually go to the seat of power. Will he?
Well, you would think that in as much as he really did issue a pretty comprehensive and long speech, that he would have, if he considered the financial factor to be of any importance at all, that he would have at least alluded to it. You would think he would.
Mm,
And that's why I asked the question. I don't know how his mind is conditioned. If he comes from a labor background, he's going to be work oriented. And that means that he would probably be more concerned that labor is properly remunerated in his way of thinking than toward any consideration of inheritance.
mm,
Because labor tends to be prejudiced against inheritance because they feel that it leads to the concentration of wealthy families and so on and so forth. So it's really hard to know. I don't know what his motivation is, whether it's just that he is what he is or whether he is doing what he does consciously. I don't know. And I
mm.
see that that's your concern too, right?
It is, absolutely. It's my concern. And that question of inheritance, what we're talking about here, ladies and gentlemen, viewers, is the actual cultural inheritance, advanced control, automation, robotics, industry, steam power, nuclear power, electrical energy, hydrocarbon energy. These are all part of the cultural inheritance. And correctly, if they're harnessed correctly, then of course industry is released to produce the goods and services necessary with the minimum amount of labour. Now
Exactly.
the question that comes to the forefront in something like that, the philosophical question is, should each individual in society be entitled to a share of their claim of that cultural inheritance, which of course would be reflected in an issue of a financial dividend, so that they could actually purchase what the machines are making. Whereas if Mark Latham is just talking about Western Sydney getting a job for someone, whether they need to work or not, then that's no answer at all. It's not actually taking the narrative to the 21st century. What it's doing is it's putting us back. It's essentially deindustrializing and just giving people what I call, excuse the French, bullshit jobs, completely unnecessary jobs, when they could be actually left alone to actually find their own bit of, if you like, utopia in their own part of ship. Sufficient financial security issued in the form of a dividend, debt-free, and certainly not from a private institution, but from a public authority, namely the National Credit Authority. Wallace.
Well, yeah, so long as we continue to genuflect before work and idealize the so-called work ethic, what we're doing is we're actually becoming slaves to work. We're not using work in an efficient manner to release us from work. We are using work to literally perpetuate our slavery to it. And the conservatives are especially ideologically oriented in that way. It's just amazing to watch them because, I mean, it is a very anti-Christian and irrational position. I mean, how can you possibly argue for full employment when full employment necessarily means a degradation of actual industrial production efficiency? If you're trying to be efficient, you're trying to minimize the amount of human labor that's required to perform a given task. If you don't benefit from that, the results that flow from that, in terms of adequacy of goods and services and more freedom to enjoy them, what have you gained? You see, and the whole world is enthralled to this idea of the work ethic. Well, the work ethic, looked in one way, if you're doing something worthwhile and genuine, and it implies honesty, that's fine, that's good. But if it means just perpetual engagement in activity for the sake of activity rather than for the sake of freeing us, then it's a very, very damaging thing. And of course, the whole world is engaged in that. You'll see this. It's like in the United States, Donald Trump is not talking about social dividends. He's talking about jobs. And of course, they're engaging in quite a battle with China over this very issue. And it's the old thing of competition for markets to provide sales and the jobs that go with it, and which are essential in the eyes of the presiding authorities to provide incomes for people so that they can actually claim a portion of the goods and services. The thing of it is, we have to understand that it's simply true that production is not produced by labor. That's a Marxist concept. And quite frankly, the conservatives are absolutely beholden to this idea. And it means that it's a dialectic thing again. The two sides are bound together by a common ethic. It's the Puritan work ethic. And it's the making of an end of a means. And you don't make an end of a means. You use a means in order to achieve an end. You don't make an end of it. That's a perversion.
I find the dialectical approach is essentially an outworking of their dogma or their philosophy, being Manichaeistic dualism, and if you like, the Trinitarian concept, mutual love and cooperation. The Trinitarian concept is that there is truth and there is purpose. If there is purpose, why do people come together? Why do they build industry? And it's simply to provide a service, the necessary service, whether it's building a road, a bridge, a sewer system, a water system, power, electricity, whatever, all goods and services. They come together for that to actually produce those things for the benefit of the community. This is where we get confused. We don't come together to get a wage. We come together to achieve a purpose, an end. The end being sufficiency, that we've got enough food, clothing and shelter. And the financial system perverts that, turns it into a dialectical argument of the haves and have-nots against each other, the male, the female, the rich nation against the poor nation, the elderly against the young against the elderly. It's all this dialectical approach, and
It is.
it's a twisting of truth. And the fact is, it wasn't that long ago that Australia, I'll say Australia here, Wallace, but I'm sure it's the same in Canada. Australia is being materially the most affluent nation in the world, in the
Yeah.
history of mankind. The most affluent. We have more technology, more goods and services, more natural resources than ever known before. And yet we can't realise this into an outworking of saying we have material security. In actual fact, our children are beholding for generations of debt, in order to purchase what is already being produced in front of them, and that is their own homes. And that to me is essentially, as it's said, the abstraction is more real than the real world. We look at the real world, it's a place of abundance. The
Um,
abstraction, the financial system, is one of scarcity, and we're struggling and vying over each other, climbing over each other to achieve the crumbs necessary. And it really is an insidious black magic. Wallace.
it certainly is, Arnie. The thing of it is, it's what we might call a costive or constipated economy, that everything gets balled up at the consumption end. It gets obstructed, and you can only get rid of what you produced if you can sell it, and you can only sell it if consumers have sufficient money to buy it.
That's right.
And they don't have sufficient money increasingly, because capital costs become greater than labor costs as a cost factor in prices.
Hmm.
And so obviously, the more that you modernize and make your system efficient, the more it becomes balled up at
Hmm.
the consumption end.
Hmm.
And so the only way you can handle that is to go into debt, to mortgage your future
Hmm.
in order to obtain what you're producing today. And so it can only get more and more and more dependent upon debt, which is extending greater and greater and further into the future.
Hmm.
So, and this leads to just nothing but conflict, because everybody is struggling.
Hmm.
They're struggling to survive in a world that is being made physically far more abundant than we've ever seen. But nevertheless, that abundance is being held back. Even the abundance that we have is being held back because production cannot freely sell its product.
Hmm.
There's a struggle there, and there's the debt factor, which loads down everyone. The financial factor is absolutely critical, because it fundamentally is the means by which human beings are brought into subservience and slavery. They're in slavery to constant
Hmm.
works which increasingly are questionable, irrelevant, and destructive,
Hmm.
because we are so engaged in war,
Hmm.
and or the threat of war. We're engaged in preparations for wars that occur and which don't occur,
Hmm.
but which are always threatening and which are always imminent because of the competition between nations for markets.
Hmm.
And we have, it's not just what we're doing today, it's the potential we have. We have a potential to do far, far more than even the startling achievements that we've made today on a physical level. The
That's right.
financial system is a system of accountancy. And if you cook your books, if you misrepresent the realities of your business operations, that's going to lead to some serious trouble.
Hmm.
Either it's going to lead to the breakdown of your system, or you're going to end up in serious legal problems.
Hmm.
And of course, what it will do is ultimately lead to the breakdown of the enterprise. And the enterprise of humanity is got potential that is just absolutely astonishing.
Hmm.
But we are, because of a financial system, and it's the thing of it is, the financial system is used for the purposes of aiding and abetting a power struggle, a struggle to dominate the individual and control the individual's life and the individual's activities,
Hmm.
and prevent the individual from having the economic independence which allows him to see. Douglas said that economics is it can be considered as a philosophy of life, but it isn't. It's just a functional activity of men and women in the world. Well, for goodness sake, let's make the function as efficiently as possible, and let's make it possible for the results of the function to flow to the individuals in society. And that's
I see that as the key. That's exactly right, Wallace. That the industry is there. It's capable of producing. I mean, look at Detroit. Look at Chicago. These cities are ghost towns, and yet they were manufacturing hubs. Manufacturing hubs, well capable of producing huge amounts of industry. And and the fact is that what are we saying? That they have to be shut down because we don't have enough sufficient numbers? We don't have sufficient electronic blips on the computer to actually release the debt? I mean, we mentioned in On Target, was it last week, week before, 270 something trillion worth of debt. Now, the gross domestic product, that means everything that we produce for the entire year. If we produced that for 3 years and we had a market somewhere we could sell it all, the gross domestic product for 3 years is still insufficient to liquidate the existing debt in the world. Now, that debt is owed to private institutions. Private institutions, you call them banks, they're private institutions. Shareholders, but essentially dominant. You go and have a look at who are the principal shareholders for major banks around the world, and you'll see that individuals are. And on the basis of that, those banks who create all this credit, we call it debt, now own everything the world produces for 3 years. They own because they can actually create money off their own, if you like, their own ledger, and issue it as property, issue it as a debt to the community so that the community can actually get to work and produce these things. You could turn Chicago or Detroit on in a heartbeat. You could turn those industries back on. All you've got to do is release the credit, not the debt. Release the credit. And that credit is in the form of in the hands of the community where they could actually buy what Chicago and Detroit produce. And this is the anomaly, this glaring anomaly that's sitting there in front of us, and it's a question that has not been answered correctly for thousands and thousands of years. Wally.
No, if you go back over the history of money, it's just replete with oppression, exploitation, and so on. Yes, it is. The thing of it is, Arnie, I don't. It's hard to. It seems hard to make the point, but money is not something that you carry around in wheelbarrows. It's not something you drive around in automobiles. It's not something that you ship by rail. Money is just simply a record. It's accountancy in the modern world. We have to have accountancy or we couldn't function properly. But it simply represents the wealth of the world, the way it's created, the way it's transferred, the way it is consumed. It belongs to the community. It does not belong to some organization that arrogates to itself the power to create the money and say that they own it, because it's just a reflection of the community's real wealth. And the community has to reassert its ownership of those credits, that abstract system of credits that we use to record our activities, because we are the ones who create the wealth of the nation. It isn't these credit issuing, these people who specialize in abstractions, because Money is not a concrete thing. It's a representation.
That's right. Like a pound, a kilo, a kilometre,
yeah,
a weight. In
that's
actual
right.
fact, I noted, was it yesterday, day before, in our constitution, the federal government not only is responsible for coinage and issuing of credit of the nation, they're also responsible for weights and measures. And to me, that's the very same thing. In the economic sphere, weights and measures of the economic sphere aren't just the weight of produce, it's also the value of it. Just another system.
It's a
And they're
measure.
responsible. It's a measure, that's right. Money is only a measure. So you turn around and you say, well, this item is worth $1 or it's worth $10, and it's coming off the conveyor belt. There isn't an appropriate $10 issued into the community in order to purchase it, and that's the problem.
But if you were to measure this real wealth in pounds or feet or inches or kilos or whatever you use, you can make a realistic representation of it, right?
Yeah.
However, if in your financial measurements you are not accurate in the way you do that, then obviously you're throwing things all out of kilter. And if you can make a shortage of those abstract credits, then the power of issuing them, it transfers to the issuer of credit instead of the people who are simply creating the wealth and claiming it.
That's right.
So that they are able to, by all of the documents, all of the documents, I mean the instruments of investment and so on, which are involved with this, that is possible through maintaining a shortage of credits, a monopoly, to actually cause a centralization of wealth, which flows to the center, to the people who are able to have ownership in these credit issuing bodies. And so that it instead of, in nature, things tend to just flow. In our system, things tend to flow to the center. They should flow out into the community. That's where they're really needed.
Yeah.
And so we're in violation of natural law, the way we do things. Our accountancy system is fundamentally, in my view of thinking, certainly Douglas pointed that out, that it is a violation of reality because it is a misrepresentation of what's actually going on in the physical world with regard to production and consumption. Now, and people, for some reason or other, so many people they're running around like chickens with their heads cut off, like looking for this and looking for that and trying to solve this problem and trying to solve that problem, when they completely neglect the machine that actually runs and dominates the whole thing, the financial system, because that is where the real power is, and that is where the real power lies, in the ability to mobilize productive forces and to distribute the results that flow from that mobilization. So it's an abstract situation. Now, unfortunately, people are easily duped by abstractions because they tend not to think in terms like that, and the average person isn't really that. It's not that they're incapable of understanding the basics of these things. It's that they have been misled so badly by propaganda and so on, which has been fed them. They have been mind controlled so that they are not inclined to think of things like that. It's in any system, I think you have to be aware of the nature of the system and the control mechanisms of the system. If you're trying to run a system and you have absolutely no appreciation of the nature of the control center, I think you're going to come to a bad end.
Yep. No, I appreciate that, Wally. I'm going to pull us up on that simply because we've covered the subject well, and I see it as this is to me is a discipline on each individual in order to actually come to grips with it, and the League has continues to provide an excellent educational resource through our websites, through our social credit training, through our social dynamics, and even these videos. It's a continuous basis of education, of, if you like, re-education and demesmerization. How do you actually turn the black magic off? You stop believing in it. You stop
What
believing
happens to a nation without knowledge?
That's
And,
right. Yeah.
What happens to any enterprise without knowledge?
That's right. That's right. They just atrophy. Yeah.
That's right.
Atrophy. Wally Klinck, thank you so much for today and for our discussions. I enjoy them. I know we cover some at times difficult ground, but all the more reason. And to Mark Latham for standing up. Okay, congratulations for standing up. But Mark, if you don't deal with the root cause of the problem, you're not dealing with anything. Thanks, Wally.
That's right. Thank you, Arnie. It's always nice to be with you, and I appreciate the opportunity to discuss these things with you in the hope that we might help other people to understand some of these things and hope that we ourselves are guided in understanding them properly ourselves.
That's right. And that's what the forum's about. Not perfect, but continue to pursue truth. This is Arnie Luks at the Freedom Forum with Wally Klinck from Canada. Thanks, ladies and gentlemen.